"I will not present my strategy to a man like him," Preston Hale said, loud enough for every investor in the glass boardroom to hear. The room went silent. Malcolm Reed stood near the doorway of Helix Core Systems headquarters, wearing a dark gray suit, polished black shoes, and carrying a black notebook worn at the corners. He did not raise his chin. He did not demand attention. He simply stood still, calm enough to make the insult feel even uglier. Behind him, San Francisco glowed through the glass walls of the 42nd floor. On the main screen were the words that had brought everyone into that room. Series D Strategic Presentation. Proposed valuation $8.4 billion. Around the long white table sat investors, board members, lawyers, finance leaders, and assistants who had stopped typing at the exact same time. Water glasses shook slightly from the air conditioning. The ceiling lights reflected off the polished table like cold white knives. On the conference console, a small red recording light blinked. Preston did not notice it. He was too busy looking at Malcolm as if the new chief executive officer were a stain on the company name. Elaine Porter, chairwoman of the board, rose slowly from her seat. Jordan Ellis, chief financial officer, lowered his eyes to the deck in front of him. Nina Brooks, head of legal, opened her laptop without a word. Ava Monroe, the young analyst Preston had ordered out of the preparation room minutes earlier, stood near the back wall with a folder pressed so tightly to her chest that the papers bent. Preston smiled. "Record it if you want," he said. "I have enough equity in this company to say what everyone else is thinking." Within 12 minutes, those words would enter the official minutes. Within 20 minutes, Preston would learn that the equity he used as armor had a conduct clause attached to it. And before noon, the man who thought he could refuse to recognize a black chief executive officer would watch 100% of his executive equity rights freeze under a contract he had signed himself. But in that first moment, Malcolm Reed did not strike back. He walked to the chair marked Chief Executive Officer, opened his notebook, and wrote down the time, 9:03. Then he looked at Preston. "Mr. Hale," Malcolm said, "are you certain you want that statement entered into the meeting record?" Preston laughed. That was the mistake. Conference Room Orion had been designed to make powerful people feel safe. The walls were glass, but the soundproofing was perfect. The chairs were soft enough for long negotiations. The investor folders were stacked in neat black rows. The Helix Core logo glowed on the screen, silver letters against deep blue. Everything looked controlled. But control was exactly what the company was losing. Helix Core Systems had once been one of the most admired technology companies in enterprise artificial intelligence. Its platform helped hospitals predict supply shortages, shipping networks reroute freight, and retailers prepare for demand shocks before shelves went empty. Revenue had climbed fast. Big customers had signed. Reporters called Helix Core a future category leader. But inside the company, something was breaking. Senior engineers were leaving. Employee complaints were rising. 2 former managers had hired lawyers. Women and minority employees in the strategy division were leaving at almost double the company average. A confidential culture report had been pushed into an appendix. And the investor deck for the $8.4 billion funding round had made everything look clean. Too clean. That was why the board had brought in Malcolm Reed. He was not hired for appearance. He was hired because he had saved 3 companies from quiet collapse. He was a former engineer, former finance operator, and turnaround chief executive officer who understood that companies rarely fail all at once. They rot first in the rooms where people are punished for telling the truth. Preston Hale hated him before they shook hands. Preston was 56 years old, silver-haired, sharp-suited, and used to being obeyed. He was not a founder of Helix Core, but he had joined early enough to speak as if the walls belonged to him. He controlled strategy partnerships. He controlled enterprise sales narratives. He controlled which employees were allowed into investor rooms. He also controlled fear. People laughed when Preston wanted laughter. People stayed quiet when Preston cut someone down. People learned his favorite phrases: culture fit, executive presence, enterprise optics, client comfort. Preston loved those phrases because they sounded professional, but the people harmed by them knew what they meant. Ava Monroe knew. 10 minutes before the meeting, she had been in the preparation room on the 41st floor, standing beside a wall screen with the original market model open. She had built the churn analysis. She had found that 3 enterprise contracts Preston labeled committed were not signed. She had written the attrition slide that showed his division was losing talented employees faster than any other group. Then Preston entered with a coffee in one hand and impatience in his eyes. "Ava, send the file to Jordan," he said. "The presentation will be handled by people with the right presence." Ava looked at him. "I built the market model." Preston closed her laptop with 2 fingers. "And we appreciate support work." Support work. The words were soft. The slap was not. Ava felt heat climb into her face, but she did not cry. She had learned not to give Preston anything he could call emotional. She picked up her folder because she had stopped trusting that the truth would survive if she left it inside a shared drive. That was when Malcolm Reed appeared at the doorway. No entourage, no announcement, no assistant rushing ahead, just a man with a black notebook, listening before he spoke. Preston glanced at him and said, "Investor Lounge is down the hall." Malcolm answered, "I know where the Investor Lounge is." Preston frowned. "And you are Malcolm Reed." For 1 second, Preston's face went empty. Then it hardened. Malcolm looked at Ava. "Were you asked to leave the presentation team?" Ava hesitated. Preston answered for her. "She is an analyst. She is not needed in the room." Malcolm asked, "Did she build part of the deck?" "She contributed background material," Preston said. Ava held the folder tighter. Malcolm wrote 1 sentence in his notebook. "The risk may be inside the person controlling the room." Preston saw him write. "What is that supposed to mean?" Malcolm closed the notebook. "It means I take notes." Then Elaine Porter stepped into the doorway and said, "Malcolm, the board is ready." That was when Preston understood who he had almost sent down the hall. Not completely. Enough. By 8:59, the boardroom was full. Rebecca Lang from North Star Growth Partners sat on the investor side with her hands folded. Miles Chen from Harborline Ventures reviewed the printed materials. Anita Sloan from Eastbridge Capital watched Preston with the measured expression of someone who had seen confident men sell weak stories before. Jordan Ellis sat beside the financial packet, pale and tense. Nina Brooks sat near the legal console. Ava stood at the back because she had not been invited to sit. Preston stood at the screen holding the wireless clicker like a weapon. The title slide behind him read, "Helix Core Series D Strategy, Leadership Continuity and Market Expansion." Leadership continuity. That phrase meant Preston. At least he thought it did. Elaine stood at the head of the table. "Before we begin," she said, "the board will make 1 formal announcement for the record." Preston's smile tightened. Elaine continued, "As of 7 this morning, Malcolm Reed has been appointed Chief Executive Officer of Helix Core Systems, effective immediately. This decision was approved by unanimous board consent following the governance review completed last week." A light wave of applause moved through the room. Rebecca clapped first. Miles followed. Jordan tapped his fingers on the table because he was not sure how strong the applause should be. Nina did not clap. She was already watching Preston. Malcolm entered and took the chief executive chair. Preston did not move. Elaine looked at him. "Preston, you may begin the strategic presentation." He did not. 2 seconds passed, then 3, then 4. The red recording light kept blinking. Elaine said, "Preston?" He closed the slide folder. "No." The word was quiet, but it cut the room in half. Elaine asked, "Please clarify." Preston looked directly at Malcolm. "I will not present this strategy to him." The air changed. A legal assistant stopped typing. Jordan looked up. Ava felt her heartbeat in her throat. Malcolm did not move. Elaine's voice became hard. "What exactly do you mean by him?" Preston placed the clicker on the table. "I built this strategy for investors who understand enterprise discipline and for a board that knows what this company needs. I will not have it filtered through someone installed this morning to satisfy diversity optics." Rebecca Lang leaned back. Nina typed. Malcolm looked at Preston. "Mr. Hale, you are presenting company strategy to the lawful chief executive officer, the board, and current investors. You are not presenting to my personality. You are presenting to the office." Preston laughed once. "The office is not the problem." Everything froze. Elaine said, "Stop." But Preston mistook the warning for weakness. He looked around the room as if waiting for someone to join him. No one did. Then he said the sentence that destroyed the old order. "I'm not taking direction from a chief executive chosen to make the company look diverse while the rest of us do the serious work." The sentence did not echo. It landed. Heavy, complete, ugly. Ava closed her eyes. Jordan stared at the table. Elaine's face went pale with anger. Malcolm opened his notebook again and wrote the time. 9:04. Then he looked up. Mr. Hale, I will give you one opportunity to correct the record. Do you wish to withdraw that statement, apologize to the room, and proceed with your responsibilities? Preston smiled because he thought calm was fear. No, he said. I will not apologize for protecting this company from a symbolic appointment that confuses customers, investors, and employees who know how this business really works. Nina stopped typing. She looked at Elaine. Elaine gave the smallest nod. Malcolm closed his notebook. Then this is now a governance matter. Preston laughed louder. A governance matter? You have been here for less than 3 hours, Malcolm said, long enough to hear what needed hearing. Preston turned toward the investors. Are we seriously doing this? I own enough equity to make this round very uncomfortable if this board forgets who built the strategy. That sentence changed Jordan's face. That was Preston's favorite weapon. Fear. Fear of losing investors. Fear of losing customers. Fear that if Preston walked out, the valuation would collapse before lunch. For years it had worked. Then Nina Brooks stood. She was calm, precise, and completely still. Mr. Hale, she said, for the record, Helix Core is preserving the meeting transcript, the room recording log, and all comments made after the chief executive appointment was introduced. Preston waved a hand. Preserve whatever you want. Nina connected her laptop to the side display. A document appeared. Executive Equity Conduct Agreement. Preston Hale, document identification number EECA 14.7. Preston's eyes narrowed. What is this? Nina said. You signed this agreement on March 14th, 2022. I know what I signed. No, Nina said. I'm about to explain what you triggered. Preston stopped smiling. Nina read from the screen. If an executive officer engages in discriminatory conduct, refuses cooperation with a lawfully appointed chief executive officer, creates material governance risk before investors, or uses restricted equity influence to threaten company operations, the company may activate equity rights freeze pending investigation. The room went still again. Preston looked toward Elaine. Elaine did not rescue him. Nina continued. This clause temporarily freezes executive equity-related rights subject to the agreement. That includes transfer rights, option exercise rights, additional vesting rights, and voting power connected to restricted executive equity on governance matters related to the incident. Preston slammed his palm on the table. You cannot freeze 100% of my equity. Nina met his eyes. 100% of your executive equity rights subject to this agreement can be frozen pending independent investigation. No one is taking ownership today. The company is applying the clause you signed. Preston's face reddened. That clause was written to protect us from reckless executives. Malcolm looked at him. Yes. A silence opened. Then Malcolm said, and now it is doing that. No one moved. Preston looked around the table, searching for the old room, the room that would laugh, the room that would look away. The room where Ava would be told to leave, Jordan would stay silent, Elaine would calculate the cost, and legal would smooth the edges of his behavior until the investors could pretend they had not heard it. But that room was gone. Or maybe it had only been waiting for someone to put the truth on record. Preston turned to Rebecca Lang. Rebecca, you know what I have done for this company. Rebecca looked at him. I know what I just heard. He turned to Miles. Miles said, my investment committee will ask why the executive leading strategy created a live governance crisis during a Series D meeting. Preston looked at Jordan. Jordan swallowed. For years, Jordan Ellis had told himself finance stayed neutral. Numbers had no politics. Culture issues were separate from valuation unless they showed up in cash flow. Now they had shown up. In legal exposure, in investor confidence, in governance risk, in the red recording light blinking beside the console. Jordan looked at Preston. I cannot defend this. Preston stared at him. You coward. Malcolm spoke. No, he is late. That is different. Jordan lowered his eyes because the sentence was fair. Late. That word described almost everyone in the room. Elaine had been late to remove Preston Power. Jordan had been late to admit the risk. Human Resources had been late to believe complaints. The board had been late to understand that a toxic executive could make a billion-dollar company fragile. And Ava had been waiting outside rooms while late people protected early harm. At the back of the room, Ava slowly opened her folder. Inside were printed emails, old deck versions, calendar invitations with her name removed, performance notes changed after she challenged the churn numbers, a message from Preston that said, "Stay in your lane." She had brought proof because she had stopped expecting memory to be enough. Malcolm noticed. "Miss Monroe," he said. Preston snapped his head toward her. "She has no role here." Malcolm said, "She does now." Ava Hart jumped. Preston pointed toward the door. "Ava, out." No one moved. Not security, not Jordan, not Elaine, not Nina, not the investors. For the first time in 2 years, Preston gave an order and the room did not obey. Ava stepped forward. "I have the original deck versions," she said. "I have the churn data that was removed. I have the attrition report. I have emails showing I raised concerns about this investor presentation last week." Preston went still. Not because he felt guilty, because he knew she had kept records. That was his second mistake. He believed people pushed out of rooms left empty-handed, but Ava had proof. Nina looked at Elaine. Elaine looked at Malcolm. Malcolm looked at Preston. The equity freeze was only the first door opening. Behind it was everything Preston had buried. But buried things do not disappear. They wait. They wait in email folders with harmless names. They wait in old meeting notes. They wait in calendar invitations where one name was removed and another name was added. They wait in performance reviews edited after someone told the truth. They wait in the memory of people who were told to calm down, stay patient, be grateful, or learn how leadership really works. Ava Monroe had waited for 2 years. Malcolm Reed had waited for 1 morning. Preston Hale had spent nearly a decade believing nobody was coming. That was why the silence in conference room Orion felt so dangerous. Preston was not only facing a new chief executive officer, he was facing all the quiet evidence that had survived him. To understand why Malcolm did not shout when Preston insulted him, you had to go back to 5:26 that same morning. Malcolm Reed was awake before sunrise in a small hotel room on Howard Street. His suit hung from the closet door. His black notebook sat on the desk beside a cup of untouched coffee and a printed board packet marked confidential. He had slept 3 hours. Not because he was nervous, because he had spent the night reading Helix Core Systems board materials, employee attrition summaries, pending legal notices, investor call notes, executive compensation agreements, anonymous culture survey extracts. The board had sent him 300 pages. He had asked for 600 more. Most executives read the summary first. Malcolm read the appendix. His mother, Evelyn Reed, had taught middle school history in Oakland for 32 years. She used to say that powerful people put the truth in small print because they know most people are too tired to read it. His father, Joseph Reed, drove trucks across California and Nevada. When Malcolm was 10, police stopped Joseph outside Fresno because a dispatcher said his truck looked similar to another vehicle. Joseph had done nothing wrong. Still, he stood under flashing lights with his hands visible while young Malcolm sat in the passenger seat, watching his father make himself smaller to survive. That night, Joseph told him, "A good badge can save a life. A bad use of power can make an innocent man fear the light." Malcolm never forgot it. He did not grow up hating authority. He grew up hating what happened when authority refused accountability. That was why he became the kind of leader who listened before he spoke. At 6:10, Malcolm opened the governance review file again, case number HCS Governance 0917. The file did not accuse Preston of one dramatic crime. That would have been easier. Instead, it showed patterns. Patterns were more dangerous. A senior product manager had left after being told she lacked executive polish. A black sales director was removed from a client pitch after Preston wrote that the customer needed a familiar face. A Latina engineer received the highest technical score on a leadership panel and still lost the promotion to a man Preston called more client-ready. 3 women in strategy left within 7 months. 2 employees had filed internal complaints. 1 complaint vanished into human resources language. Miscommunication, tone conflict, performance alignment. Malcolm had seen those phrases before. At bad companies, bias rarely arrived wearing a sign. It arrived wearing policy language. It entered rooms as preference. It stayed there as tradition. At 6:38, Malcolm read the Executive Equity Conduct Agreement. Document Identification Number EECA 14.7. Preston had signed it on March 14, 2022. The signature was bold, confident, almost careless. The clause was clear. If an executive officer engaged in discriminatory conduct, obstructed a lawfully appointed chief executive officer, created material governance risk before investors, or used restricted equity influence to threaten company operations, the company could freeze executive equity-related rights pending independent investigation. Transfer rights, option exercise rights, additional vesting, voting power connected to restricted executive equity on matters related to the incident, 100% of the rights subject to the agreement, not ownership seizure, not punishment before investigation, a freeze, a legal pause, a way to stop a powerful executive from using equity as a hostage rope around the company neck. Malcolm read it twice. Then he wrote in his notebook, if Hale threatens the company with his shares, he steps onto the wire he signed. He closed the notebook. He did not hope Preston would step there, but he knew men like Preston often mistook warnings for invitations. At 7:01, Elaine Porter called. Malcolm answered on speaker while putting on his cufflinks. Elaine said, "Board consent is complete. Appointment effective 7 this morning. Nina is prepared. Jordan is nervous. Preston does not know yet." Malcolm adjusted his sleeve. "He will know soon." Elaine sighed. "I should warn you, he will test you. Of course. He may do it publicly. Then the public record will matter." Elaine went quiet. "That is why I chose you." "No," Malcolm said. "You chose me because the company is bleeding talent and pretending the carpet is clean." Elaine did not deny it. She said, "I was late." Yes. That answer hurt her. Malcolm meant it to, but he did not say it with cruelty. "Late is not the same as useless," he added, "unless you stay late on purpose." Elaine breathed out. "I do not intend to." "Good," Malcolm said. "Then bring every policy you were afraid to use." By 7:45, Malcolm entered Helix Corps through the employee lobby, not the executive garage. The receptionist looked surprised when he gave his name. She checked the morning security list and found the entry. Malcolm Reed, Chief Executive Officer, effective 7/00, temporary access badge issued by board office. She looked up at him differently after reading it. Malcolm noticed. People often found respect faster when a screen told them to. He thanked her and walked past the elevators into the main work floor. He did not want his first view of the company to be from the boardroom. Boardrooms were staged. Work floors told the truth. The main office had open desks, quiet conference rooms, glass meeting pods, and the kind of polished energy technology companies use to hide exhaustion. A few employees whispered when they saw him. Some recognized his name. Most did not. Near the pantry, he saw a young engineer stop speaking when Preston Hale passed by. That was the first sign. In the strategy wing, 2 analysts were standing over a forecast sheet. The moment they heard Preston's voice from the hallway, one closed the file. That was the second sign. In the preparation room, Malcolm saw the third. Ava Monroe stood at the front table with a laptop open and a folder beside her. She was 29, composed, and visibly tired in the way people become tired when they have spent years choosing every word carefully. Her hair was pulled back. Her blazer was neat. Her hands rested on the edge of the table, near a stack of printed slides covered in yellow notes. Preston entered with his coffee and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ava, send the file to Jordan. The presentation will be handled by people with the right presence." Right presence. Malcolm heard it. Ava heard it differently because she had heard it too many times. She said, "I built the market model." Preston closed her laptop. "And we appreciate support work." That was when Malcolm stepped into the room. He did not interrupt with anger. Anger would have allowed Preston to call him emotional before the day even began. Instead, Malcolm asked questions. "Were you asked to leave the presentation team? Did you contribute to the materials? Do you have the original data?" Ava looked at him for the first time with caution. Not hope. Hope was too expensive. Caution. She said, "Yes." Preston answered over her. She contributed background material. Malcolm wrote one sentence. "The risk may be inside the person controlling the room." Preston did not understand the sentence. Ava did. For 2 years, Preston had controlled rooms. He decided who spoke on client calls. He decided whose slides survived. He decided whose mistakes became coaching and whose questions became attitude problems. He had a gift for making exclusion sound strategic. When a black manager named Terrence Cole was removed from a national retail pitch, Preston wrote, "Client rapport risk." When a female engineer named Priya Nair challenged deployment timelines, he wrote, Needs maturity under pressure. When Ava flagged inflated retention numbers, he replied by email, "Your concerns are noted. Stay in your lane." Ava printed that email. She printed many things. She did not know when she would use them. She only knew that people without power needed records because memory could be called emotion. Inside her folder were original deck versions, calendar histories, promotion matrices, anonymized attrition tables, and emails Preston probably thought she had deleted. One message showed him moving her out of a customer strategy call and adding a less experienced male analyst in her place. Another showed him asking human resources to revisit her performance language after she questioned the churn model. The subject line was clear: Ava Monroe calibration concern. She had stared at that subject line for 10 minutes the night she found it. Calibration, a clean word for punishment. That was the first time she almost quit. She had gone to the restroom on the 38th floor, locked herself in the last stall, and pressed her hands over her mouth so no one would hear her breathing break. Her father had called during lunch that same day. He owned a small print shop in Richmond and had told her, "Do not shrink yourself to fit a room built wrong." She wanted to believe him, but rent was real. Student loans were real. Health insurance was real. So she stayed. Quietly, not weak, waiting. At 8:36, Jordan Ellis stood in his office, looking at the final investor deck on his monitor. He had seen the missing attrition slide. He had seen the softened language around customer churn. He had seen Preston mark 3 unsigned renewals as committed pipeline. Jordan knew the deck was not false in a simple way. It was worse. It was arranged to make the truth hard to see. He told himself the details would be handled in diligence. He told himself investors expected optimism. He told himself Preston knew the relationship dynamics better than he did. But beneath all those explanations was fear. Preston had made careers rise and fall at Helix Core. Jordan had 2 children, a mortgage in Oakland, and a reputation built on not making enemies he could not defeat. So he stayed silent. That was his failure. He knew it before Malcolm ever said late. At 8:48, Nina Brooks reviewed the meeting protocol in the legal console. Room recording active, transcript service active, board minutes template open, governance escalation file ready. She had placed the Executive Equity Conduct Agreement in a secure tab, not because she wanted drama, but because she had been head of legal long enough to know that toxic executives loved threatening companies with the very compensation packages those companies had given them. Nina did not trust Preston. She trusted documents. At 8:55, Elaine Porter stood alone near the window before entering the boardroom. She watched the bay for a moment and thought of every complaint the board had handled too carefully, too politely, too slowly. Preston was valuable, they had said. Preston was difficult but effective. Preston was old school. Preston had investor relationships. Preston would be handled after the round had become after the next customer renewal. After the next renewal had become after the governance review. Delay had become a strategy, and delay had protected the wrong person. Elaine closed her eyes. Then she picked up the folder appointing Malcolm Reed. This time, she would not delay. At 9:03, Preston gave her the proof faster than even she expected. He refused to present. He insulted Malcolm. He threatened the funding round with his equity. Then Nina opened the agreement on screen. Now, as Ava stood at the back of conference room Orion with her folder open, and Preston realized she had kept records, Malcolm understood the next part of the morning would not be about one racist sentence. That sentence mattered. It was ugly. It was disqualifying. But it was also a doorway. Behind it were the hidden deck changes, the blocked promotions, the selective meeting invitations, the buried attrition data, the investor risk nobody wanted to say aloud. Malcolm looked at Ava. "Miss Monroe," he said, "if you are willing, the room will hear what was removed." Ava swallowed. Her hands shook. Preston saw the shake and smiled slightly, as if fear still belonged to him. But Ava did not step back. She opened the folder wider. "I will need the original deck on screen," she said. Nina looked at Elaine. Elaine nodded. Jordan looked at Malcolm. Malcolm looked at Ava. "Take your time," he said. Ava lifted the first page, and Preston Hale, for the first time that morning, understood that the woman he had pushed out of the room had walked back in carrying the room with her. Ava Monroe stood near the end of the conference table with her folder open. Her hands were shaking. She hated that. Preston saw the tremor and smiled, because men like him often mistook fear for weakness. He had built half his power on that mistake. He believed if someone trembled, they would obey. If someone paused, they would retreat. If someone spoke carefully, they could be interrupted. But Ava had not carried those papers for decoration. She had carried them because proof weighs less than regret. Nina Brooks connected the original investor deck to the screen. The title slide appeared again. Helix Core Series D Strategy, Leadership Continuity and Market Expansion. Preston stepped forward. This is absurd. We are not letting a junior analyst hijack a funding meeting. Malcolm Reed looked at him. You already did that. The room went still. Malcolm continued. Now we are repairing the damage with facts. Preston looked at Elaine Porter. Elaine, you cannot allow this. Investors came for strategy, not internal therapy. Rebecca Lang spoke before Elaine could answer. I came for risk clarity. If the person who built part of the model says information was removed, I want to hear it. Miles Chen nodded. So do I. Preston's jaw tightened. He had expected hesitation. He had expected fear. He had not expected investors to ask for the voice he had spent years excluding. Ava took one breath. Then she placed the first printed page on the table. This is the version of the deck from last Tuesday at 11:42 at night. File name Series D Market Model Draft 6. My name appears in the revision history. The version sent to investors yesterday removed 3 risk slides. Nina looked at the document. Do you have the metadata? Yes. Ava handed over a printed export. Nina reviewed it. Confirmed. Revision history shows Ava Monroe as author of the Market Risk section. Preston rolled his eyes. She compiled data. That does not make her the author of strategy. Ava turned to him. I built the churn correction. Preston said, you built a pessimistic interpretation. Ava clicked to a slide. The screen showed customer retention. The investor version displayed a clean number, 92% enterprise retention. Ava changed the view. The original slide appeared. 78% fully executed renewal retention, 92% only if unsigned verbal commitments are included. A soft sound moved through the room, not a gasp. Worse, investors reading too quickly at the same time. Jordan Ellis leaned forward, color draining from his face. Ava said, 3 accounts listed as committed are not signed. 1 is still in procurement review. 1 requested a price reduction. 1 delayed renewal pending product reliability data. Rebecca Lang looked at Jordan. Is that accurate? Jordan swallowed. The unsigned renewals were considered high confidence. Rebecca did not blink. That was not my question. Jordan looked at the screen. Yes, it is accurate that they are not signed. Preston stepped in. Every growth company includes forecast confidence. Ava nodded. Yes, but the deck did not label them forecast. It labeled them committed. Miles Chen wrote something on his tablet. That was the first crack. Ava clicked again. The next slide showed employee attrition. This slide was in the original packet, she said. It was removed from the investor version, Preston spoke sharply, because it was not relevant to the funding narrative. Ava looked at him. It shows the strategy division losing women and minority employees at nearly twice the company average over 24 months. The room became colder. She continued. It also shows that teams reporting directly to Mr. Hale had the highest rate of transfer requests, medical stress leave, and exit interviews citing hostile communication. Preston laughed. Hostile communication. That is what people call standards now. Malcolm looked at Nina. Please note that, Nina typed. Preston snapped toward Malcolm. Are you going to note every sentence I say? Malcolm answered, only the ones that matter. Ava looked down at her folder and pulled out a printed email. This is from March 8th. I asked why the attrition slide was removed. Mr. Hale replied, investors do not fund weakness. Then he told me to stay in my lane. She placed it beside the first page. Nina read the header, from Preston Hale to Ava Monroe. Subject investor deck discipline. Preston's face reddened. That email is being taken out of context. Ava nodded once. Then let us add context. She pulled another page. This is the calendar invitation for the North Star Growth pre-meeting on April 2nd. I was included because I built the customer segmentation model. 2 hours later, I was removed and replaced by Cole Whitman. Rebecca looked up. Cole Whitman presented that section to us. Ava said, he did. He joined the company 5 months earlier. He did not build the model. He asked me for talking points before the call. Rebecca turned to Preston. Why was Ava removed? Preston said, Cole had stronger executive presence. Ava looked at him. That phrase appears in 7 performance notes for women and minority employees under your division. Nina stopped typing for half a second, then resumed. Preston stared at Ava. You've been collecting files on me. Ava's voice was quiet. I have been keeping records of my own work. There was a difference. Everyone felt it. Preston pointed at her folder. This is betrayal, Malcolm said. No, this is documentation. Preston turned on him. You planned this, Malcolm answered. I arrived this morning. You brought the conduct. Ava brought the records. The words were calm. That made them worse. At 9:23, Nina received a message from her legal analyst at the side table. She read it, then looked at Elaine. Elaine nodded. Nina spoke. For the record, Human Resources has confirmed 2 open complaints naming Mr. Hale and 4 closed complaints from the last 18 months. 3 closed files cite management discretion as the resolution category. Malcolm asked, who closed them? Nina looked at the document. Human Resources Director Victor Lang with executive input from Preston Hale. Preston said, Of course I gave input. They were about my team. Nina looked at him. That is part of the concern. Ava pulled another page from her folder. This is from my performance calibration. After I challenged the churn model, my collaboration score was lowered from exceeds expectations to needs alignment. Jordan closed his eyes. He remembered that meeting. Preston had said Ava was talented but not ready for senior exposure. Jordan had said nothing. The phrase had passed through the room like smoke under a closed door. Malcolm looked at Jordan. Were you present? Jordan opened his eyes. Yes. Did you agree? Jordan hesitated. Preston stared at him. Jordan looked at Ava. No, I did not agree. I stayed silent. Ava's face changed. Not satisfaction, pain, because sometimes hearing the truth hurts more when it arrives late. Jordan continued. Ava built the cleanest market model in the room. I knew that. I allowed Preston to frame her as difficult because I did not want to fight before the investor cycle. Preston slapped the table. Unbelievable. Jordan turned to him. No. What is unbelievable is that I called myself neutral while letting you punish the person who was right. The room went quiet. That was the first bystander choosing to stop being furniture. Preston looked around again, but the old room kept failing him. Rebecca Lang looked at Elaine. As an investor, I need to know whether the deck we received is materially reliable. Elaine inhaled. We will review every figure before any financing decision continues. Preston barked, that will delay the round. Elaine looked at him. Then it will delay the round. He stared. For the first time in years, Elaine Porter did not calculate the cost of Preston anger before answering him. Malcolm watched her, late, but not useless. Ava clicked to the last slide. This one had no polished graphics, just a table. Column 1, original data. Column 2, investor deck. Column 3, change made by strategy leadership. The differences were not dramatic one by one. That was how the deception worked. A label softened, a risk moved, a chart filtered, an unsigned renewal upgraded, an attrition problem removed, a complaint trend renamed. But together the changes created a different company, a cleaner company, a safer company, a company that did not exist. Ava said, this deck tells investors Helix Core has leadership continuity, but it hides that the leadership being continued is one of the reasons people are leaving. Nobody spoke. Then Malcolm stood. He did not stand quickly. He did not need to. He looked at the investors. You came here to decide whether Helix Core deserves more capital at an $8.4 billion valuation. You have now seen 2 truths at once. The product has value. The culture has risk. Preston tried to interrupt. Malcolm held up one hand. Stop. One word. The room obeyed, not because he shouted, because authority had finally found its center. Malcolm continued. We can pretend the problem is one offensive comment and move on, or we can admit what the evidence shows. This company has allowed a senior executive to control access, shape investor truth, retaliate against internal challenge, and use equity as leverage against governance. Preston said, allegedly. Nina answered, pending investigation. Malcolm nodded. Correct, pending investigation. That is why the freeze exists, not to punish before proof, to protect the company while proof is reviewed. Rebecca leaned forward. What happens now? Malcolm looked at Nina. Nina said, The equity freeze notice will be issued immediately under EECA 14.7. Preston Hale is suspended from any strategic presentation, investor communication, data room access, or governance vote connected to the incident and investigation. Independent counsel will be appointed by the Board Governance Committee before end of day. Preston laughed harshly. "You are removing me from my own presentation," Elaine said. "Yes." He turned toward her. "After everything I did for this company," Elaine's voice was steady. "After everything you did to it." Preston stared at her. The sentence hit harder because Elaine had once protected him with softer words. Now she was done translating harm into difficulty. At 9:31, the side door opened and Victor Lang, the Human Resources Director, stepped in. He looked unprepared, holding a tablet and wearing the expression of a man who had hoped this meeting would not reach his department. Nina had summoned him through the internal legal channel. Malcolm looked at him. "Mr. Lang, please sit." Victor sat at the far end. Preston smiled again, faintly. "Victor, tell them how many of these complaints were found to be unsupported." Victor looked at Preston, then at Malcolm, then at Ava. A long silence followed. Victor said, "The files were not fully investigated." Preston's face changed. Victor continued, "They were administratively closed." Nina asked, "Why?" Victor looked ashamed. "Because I was told the timing was sensitive. Because there were investor cycles. Because Mr. Hale was considered essential. Because I chose process language over conflict." Ava looked at him. "You knew." Victor did not defend himself. "Yes." That word fell in the room and stayed there. Ava did not cry. She had already spent those tears alone in restroom stalls and parked cars and late trains home. But her voice changed. "You let them tell me it was a communication issue." Victor nodded. "Yes." "You let them tell me I needed executive maturity." "Yes." "You let them take my work and call me difficult for asking why." Victor's voice broke. "Yes." Malcolm watched Ava carefully. This was not a performance. This was someone hearing that the wall had always known it was a wall. Preston snapped, "Victor, you are destroying yourself." Victor looked at him. "No, I did that earlier." That was the second bystander stepping out of silence. Nina added his statement to the record. Ava slowly closed her folder. For the first time all morning, she looked tired enough to sit down. Malcolm saw it. "Miss Monroe, please take a seat." Ava almost refused out of habit. Then she sat. Preston remained standing, alone now. He looked at the investors, the board, the legal screen, the frozen equity clause, the analyst he had dismissed, the finance chief who had stopped protecting him, the human resources director who had admitted failure, and the new chief executive officer he had tried to humiliate before the meeting began. His voice dropped. "You all think you can run this company without me?" Malcolm answered, "No. We think the company cannot survive if it remains afraid of you." No one came to Preston's defense. That was when he finally understood. The freeze was not the end. It was the beginning of the investigation. And Ava Monroe had only shown the first folder. The second folder was thinner. That made Preston Hale more nervous. A thick folder could be dismissed as anger. Too many pages gave powerful men a place to hide. They could call it complicated. They could ask for context. They could say the evidence needed review. They could bury the truth under process until everyone got tired. But a thin folder meant someone had chosen carefully. Ava placed it on the table. "Inside are the records showing this was not only about me," she said. Conference room Orion went still. Preston gave a short laugh, but there was no weight behind it. Malcolm Reed looked at Nina Brooks. "Please display the first document." Nina scanned the page and connected it to the main screen. A clean white email appeared above the table, enlarged for every investor, board member, lawyer, and assistant to read. Subject line, Enterprise Presence Review. Sender, Preston Hale. Recipients, Victor Lang from Human Resources, 2 strategy directors. Date, January 17th. Ava read it aloud because she wanted the room to hear the words in a human voice. "We need to be more careful about who represents Helix Core in senior customer rooms. Technical skill is not enough. Some people create questions about polish before the product is even discussed." She stopped. Preston folded his arms. "That is standard customer strategy." Ava clicked to the attachment. "This is the caution list sent with the email." 5 names appeared on the screen. Terrence Cole, Ava Monroe, Priya Nair, Daniela Reyes, Marcus Bell. Rebecca Lang leaned forward. Ava said, "Every person on that list was either Black, Latino, or a woman in a technical leadership role." Preston shook his head. That is an interpretation. Ava nodded once. Then here is the calendar history. Nina displayed the next document, original invitation, North Star Growth Partners Product Reliability Meeting, invited speakers, Ava Monroe, Terrence Cole, Priya Nair, revised invitation, Ava removed, Terrence removed, Priya removed, Cole Whitman added, Sean Briggs added. Rebecca looked at the screen. I remember that meeting. Ava turned to her. You asked about deployment failure rates and hospital routing. Cole Whitman said the issue was isolated. Jordan Ellis spoke before anyone expected him to. It was not isolated. Everyone looked at him. Jordan's face was pale, but his voice held. Ava had prepared a full risk note. It included incident clusters, delayed fixes, and customer support overload. Preston removed the note from the briefing. I knew it existed. I let the meeting move forward without it. Rebecca put down her pen. That affected investor diligence. Jordan swallowed. Yes. Nina typed the admission into the meeting record. Preston snapped. Jordan. Jordan did not look at him. No, Preston, I should have said this months ago. That was the first crack in Preston control, not the legal clause, not the freeze notice. A person who had stayed silent finally said, I knew. Ava felt the words move through her chest in a painful way. She had wanted validation for so long, but now that it arrived, it did not feel like victory. It felt like proof that she had not imagined the wall. Preston pointed at the screen. This proves nothing, except that business leaders make judgment calls. Malcolm looked at him. Judgment calls can be reviewed. Preston said, not by junior analysts with grudges. Malcolm turned to Nina. Please note that characterization. Nina typed. Preston looked furious. Are you going to write down everything I say? Malcolm answered. Only what reveals the pattern. Ava opened another page. This is a performance calibration record from February. Before I questioned the customer retention model, my rating was exceeds expectations. After I asked why unsigned renewals were being shown as committed, the rating changed to needs alignment. Nina displayed the document. The edit history appeared. Original reviewer note. Ava demonstrates exceptional modeling precision and strong investor material judgment. Revised reviewer note. Ava demonstrates strong technical output but requires improved alignment with executive communication norms. Jordan closed his eyes. He remembered that meeting too. Victor Lang shifted at the far end of the table. Ava looked at Victor. You signed the revised version. Victor did not speak. Preston leaned back. Because it was accurate. Ava's voice remained steady. Accurate after I disagreed with you, Preston said. You did not disagree. You challenged authority in a sensitive investor cycle. Malcolm looked at him. That is the problem. You treated accuracy as disobedience. The room absorbed that. At 9:42, a legal assistant entered the boardroom carrying a sealed packet from Equity Administration. Nina took it, checked the label, and nodded. Mr. Reed, Equity Administrator confirmation has arrived. Preston looked sharply at the packet. Already, Nina said, we prepared for governance risk before this meeting. We did not know what you would say. We did know Helix Corp needed the ability to respond if a senior executive obstructed the chief executive officer or threatened company operations in front of investors. Preston turned toward Elaine. So you set me up? Elaine Porter stood slowly. No, Preston. We built a floor because you kept making everyone else fall through it. The sentence landed with the force of years. Elaine continued before Preston could interrupt. You were warned after the product complaints. You were warned after the exit interviews. You were warned after the first governance review. You called every warning noise. Today, you decided to put the noise on microphone. Nina opened the packet. She read calmly. Equity freeze notice issued under Executive Equity Conduct Agreement, Section 14.7. Subject Executive Preston Hale. Freeze scope 100% of executive equity rights subject to agreement. Effective time 9:10 in the morning, Pacific time. Case file HCS Governance 0917. Preston gripped the edge of the table. I will get an injunction before lunch. Nina said, You may try. This is illegal. Nina looked at him. This is the clause you signed. He shouted, I did not sign away my company. Malcolm said, No one said you did. You signed away the right to use restricted equity as a weapon while misconduct is investigated. Preston stared at Malcolm. You think this makes you powerful? Malcolm answered, No, it makes the process powerful. That is the difference you never understood. Nina lifted another sheet from the packet. There is one more record. Preston became very still. Nina displayed an old board email from 2022. Subject line, Equity Conduct Clause needs teeth. Sender, Preston Hale. The room read the first lines before Nina spoke. Nina said, "This email was sent during negotiation of the Executive Equity Conduct Agreement." She read aloud. If an executive creates legal, cultural, or reputational exposure, the board must have immediate ability to freeze equity influence before that person uses shares or options to hold the company hostage. The clause needs teeth, or it is decoration. Silence followed. Ava looked at Preston. Jordan looked away. Rebecca sat back. Elaine said quietly, "Those were your words." Preston did not answer. Malcolm looked at him. "You were right when you wrote them." Preston's eyes burned. "You're enjoying this." Malcolm shook his head. "No, I'm recognizing the rare moment when a company rule finally reaches the person who thought rules were only for others." That was the reveal that changed the room completely. Preston had not merely triggered a clause he forgot, he had demanded the clause. He had wanted it strong enough to stop someone else. Years later, his own conduct had stepped directly into the trap he helped build. The authority shifted there, not from Preston to Malcolm alone, from personality to record, from volume to process, from fear to proof. Ava opened the final section of her folder. "This is the original market model," she said. "The part Preston removed does not only show cultural risk, it shows financial risk caused by cultural failure." Preston muttered, "She is not qualified to speak on valuation." Rebecca said, "I would like to hear her." Miles Chen added, "So would I." Malcolm looked at Ava. "Proceed." Ava stood straighter. "The current investor deck assumes enterprise expansion in hospital logistics, retail supply chain, and cold storage routing. But the customer success team supporting those accounts lost 17 senior employees in the last 12 months. In the teams reporting through Preston Division, the loss rate is nearly double the company average." She clicked to the next chart. The revised deck shows customer retention is stable. The original model shows retention risk rising in accounts where implementation managers changed more than once. Jordan said, "That is accurate." Preston snapped, "You are all acting like employee feelings change product value." Ava turned to him. "They do when the employees leaving are the ones who know how the product actually works." No one spoke. She continued, "The deck says Helix Core can expand with leadership continuity. The data says current leadership continuity is part of the risk." Rebecca looked at Malcolm. "What is your recommendation?" Preston tried to answer. Malcolm did not let him. "Miss Monroe built the model. She will finish." Something changed in Ava's face, not pride. Relief. She had been waiting years for someone to let her finish a sentence without having to fight for the right to breathe afterward. Ava looked down at the page, then up again. "My recommendation is to restate the investor deck before any funding commitment. Remove unsigned contracts from committed revenue. Recalculate retention using executed renewals only. Include attrition risk, include governance risk, and appoint an independent investigation into strategy division decisions before any executive incentive grant continues." Preston said, "So she wants to destroy the round." Ava answered, "No. I want investors to fund the company that exists, not the company you edited." Rebecca smiled faintly. "That is the first clear strategy sentence today." Preston looked at the investors again. "You are making a mistake. Without me, Helix Core loses its enterprise face." Malcolm said, "You are not the face, you are the filter." Then he looked around the room. "And filters can be removed." At 9:58, Nina requested a live access check from Information Security. The room waited while the request moved through the internal system. The response appeared 3 minutes later. Preston Hale, access to Investor Data Room, suspended. Preston Hale, access to Strategy Drive, suspended. Preston Hale, authority to communicate with investors on behalf of Helix Core, suspended. Preston read the screen. His lips moved, but no words came out. For years, people had watched Preston send others out of rooms. Now the company systems were doing it to him without drama. No shouting, no security spectacle. "Just access denied." Victor Lang from Human Resources spoke from the far end of the table. "I need to add something." Preston turned on him. "You have done enough." Victor flinched. Then he kept going. There were complaints that should have gone to outside review. I closed them internally after Preston pushed back. I wrote management discretion in the files because it sounded neutral. Ava stared at him. Victor's voice shook. It was not neutral. It protected him. Nina asked, "Will you provide a written statement?" "Yes." Preston laughed bitterly. "Now you find courage." Victor looked at him. "No, I found a record I cannot hide from anymore." Ava was not smiling. She did not look victorious. She looked like someone finally hearing a locked door admitted had always had a key. Elaine turned to the investors. "We owe you a corrected meeting, not a performance. Today the board is formally suspending the funding presentation until the deck is restated. The governance review is underway, and independent counsel has access to all complaints and data revisions." Miles asked, "Timeline?" Nina answered, "Initial preservation notice today by noon. Independent counsel appointed by 5 in the afternoon. Restated investor materials within 10 business days. Full governance review within 45 days. Rebecca looked at Malcolm. "And Preston," Nina said, "suspended from strategic duties pending investigation. Equity rights freeze remains active under Section 14.7. Preston stood slowly. "This company will regret humiliating me." Malcolm stood too. "No, Mr. Hale, the company regrets waiting this long." The sentence did not need volume. It had years behind it. Security appeared at the door, not because Malcolm wanted a scene, but because Nina had activated suspension protocol. 2 members of corporate security waited in silence. Nina said, "Mr. Hale, you will leave your company laptop on the table. You may take personal belongings after they are inventoried by legal. You may contact counsel. You may not contact employees about this investigation." Preston stared at his laptop. That laptop had carried decks, edits, access, messages, leverage, and the false confidence of a man who believed systems would always bend toward him. Now it was evidence. He closed it slowly and placed both hands on top. Then he looked at Ava. "This is what you wanted." Ava's voice was quiet. "No, I wanted to do my job." That answer took the last heat out of him, because there was no revenge in it, only truth. Preston walked toward the door. At the threshold, he looked back at Malcolm. "You will never control this company." Malcolm said, "I'm not here to control it. I'm here to make sure fear does not." The door closed behind Preston. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence after he left was different from the silence when he insulted Malcolm. The first silence had been fear. This one was breath. Elaine sat down slowly. Jordan rubbed both hands over his face. Victor looked at the table as if seeing it for the first time. Ava remained standing beside the screen. Malcolm turned to her. "Miss Monroe, are you able to continue?" Ava looked surprised. "Continue what?" "Your analysis." She looked around the boardroom, the same room Preston had tried to empty of her, the same investors he thought would never listen, the same screen that had carried his version of the company. Her hands were still shaking, but this time she did not hide them. "Yes," she said, "I can continue." Malcolm nodded. Then, "Please begin with the truth," he removed. Ava turned to the screen. Behind her, the title slide changed. No longer leadership continuity and market expansion. Now it read, Helix Core Series D, Corrected Risk Review. And for the first time that morning, the most important voice in the room belonged to the person Preston had tried to erase. Ava Monroe stood before the screen with the corrected deck open behind her. Helix Core Series D. Corrected Risk Review. The title looked plain. No polished slogan, no leadership continuity, no market domination language. Just the kind of words Preston hated because they did not flatter anyone. Malcolm Reed took his seat and closed his notebook. He didn't need to speak over Ava. That was the point. For 2 years, Preston Hale had made every room smaller until only his voice fit inside. Now the room was wide enough for the truth. Ava looked at Rebecca Lang, Miles Chen, Anita Sloan, Elaine Porter, Jordan Ellis, Nina Brooks, Victor Lang, and the board observers who had been silent all morning. Her hands still trembled. She let them. Then she began. The corrected model separates signed revenue from verbal renewal confidence. It also separates customer growth from support capacity. The investor version combined them in a way that made expansion look safer than it is. She clicked to the first chart. Executed enterprise retention is lower than the version sent last night, not catastrophic but material. Hospital logistics accounts remain strong when the same implementation manager stays through rollout. Retention weakens when customer teams experience turnover. Rebecca leaned forward. How much turnover? Ava clicked again. 17 senior employees left customer success in 12 months. 11 came from groups tied directly or indirectly to Preston Division. Exit interviews mentioned pressure, credit taking, removed decision authority, and fear of retaliation. Jordan looked down. He had seen those exit interviews. He had treated them as human resources material, not financial risk. That was the failure. Ava continued. The previous deck called this a staffing transition. The corrected model calls it execution risk. Miles Chen asked, "Does this change the valuation?" "Yes," Ava said. The room did not move. She continued. If the company restates committed revenue, includes attrition-linked delivery risk, and reduces the expansion assumption for hospital accounts, the proposed $8.4 billion valuation is too high for today. A board observer whispered something to another. Preston had always treated valuation like a crown. Ava treated it like a number that had to survive daylight. Rebecca asked, "What valuation range do you consider defensible?" Ava looked at Jordan. He nodded, not because he wanted to lead her, because he was ready to back the truth. Ava said, "Between $7.1 and $7.4 billion, if the company accepts governance conditions, restates the data, and preserves key talent before the next customer renewal cycle." The room absorbed the number. Lower, still strong, but honest. Anita Sloan spoke for the first time. "That is a significant reduction." Ava answered, "Yes, but it is cheaper than raising money on a story that breaks during diligence." Malcolm almost smiled. Almost. Rebecca wrote something on her pad. Then she looked at Elaine. "I would rather invest in a company that tells me the floor is cracked than one that paints over it." That sentence changed the energy in the room, not excitement. Trust beginning to return. At 10:48, the board voted to suspend the original Series D presentation and authorize a corrected investor process. Nina read the resolution into the record. Independent counsel would begin the governance investigation by 5 in the afternoon. A litigation hold would cover Preston emails, calendar records, compensation files, human resources complaints, investor deck versions, and performance calibration materials. Ava and other employees who submitted evidence would be protected from retaliation under written board order. Jordan would lead a full finance restatement under Nina's supervision. Victor Lang would be removed from control of complaint files pending review. Preston Hale would remain suspended from all strategic duties, all investor communications, all restricted data access, and all governance votes connected to the matter. The equity freeze would remain active. Not because Malcolm wanted revenge, because the company could no longer allow Preston to use ownership language as a weapon while the truth was under review. At 11:12, an outside law firm received the case. Moreno, Glass, and Patel. The matter name was simple. Helix Core Governance and Conduct Investigation, case reference HCS 0917. At 11:20, the company issued an internal preservation notice to all employees. The subject line entered hundreds of inboxes at once. Document preservation notice regarding executive conduct review. For some employees, it was just another legal email. For others, it was the first sign that the company might finally be listening. On the 38th floor, a former product manager opened it and cried in the stairwell. In the customer success area, 2 engineers looked at each other without speaking. In the strategy wing, someone whispered, "Maybe they finally saw him." Ava did not hear those whispers yet. She was still in the boardroom, sitting at the table for the first time. Not near the wall, not behind Preston, at the table. Elaine looked at her. "Miss Monroe, I owe you a direct apology." Ava turned. Elaine continued, "You should not have had to keep your own archive to be believed." Ava's voice was quiet. "No, I should not have." Elaine nodded. "And I should have acted before today." Yes. The honesty made several people shift in their seats. Ava did not make it easier. Malcolm watched her with respect. Too often, organizations ask harmed people to soften the truth so the late people can feel redeemed. Ava did not do that. She did not perform forgiveness for the comfort of the board. That was dignity. Jordan spoke next. Ava, I also owe you an apology. I saw parts of the truth before today. I called myself neutral because I was afraid of Preston Power. He looked at the printed churn report. Neutral helped him. Ava swallowed. That sentence mattered because it named the cost. Jordan continued. I will correct the financial materials and sign my name to the correction. Ava looked at him. Do that. No warmth, no cruelty, just accountability. At noon, Preston Hale tried to send messages from his personal phone to 3 senior sales directors. He told them not to cooperate. He told them Malcolm was staging a takeover. He told them the investors would regret siding with weakness. By 12:16, Nina received screenshots from 2 of the directors. By 12:22, the messages were added to the investigation file as potential interference. By 12:30, Preston lawyer called the company furious. Nina took the call. She listened. Then she said, Mr. Hale has counsel rights. He does not have witness intimidation rights. Then she ended the call. That became the third consequence. Not a speech, a boundary. Over the next 45 days, the investigation moved through Helix Core like light entering rooms that had been closed too long. Employees came forward, not all at once. Fear does not vanish because one powerful man leaves a boardroom, but it weakens when the first person is believed. Terrence Cole submitted his notes from the client pitch he had been removed from. Priya Nair submitted deployment warnings that Preston had called noise. Daniela Reyes submitted a promotion packet showing her work had been reassigned to a favored manager 2 weeks before review. Marcus Bell submitted a recording from a team meeting where Preston said enterprise customers needed people who looked like they understood tradition. Victor Lang provided a written statement admitting human resources had closed complaints too narrowly and failed to escalate patterns. Jordan submitted corrected revenue and retention models. Ava submitted the full deck history. Nina submitted the equity agreement, the freeze notice, and Preston Old emailed demanding the clause have teeth. The outside report was not gentle. It found discriminatory conduct, retaliation against employees who challenged data, misleading investor presentation practices, governance obstruction, improper use of restricted equity influence to threaten company operations, and repeated failures by leadership to intervene sooner. Preston was removed from his executive position. His unvested executive equity was canceled according to the conduct agreement after the investigation confirmed serious violation. His already vested holdings remained subject to ordinary law and shareholder agreements, but he lost the special rights he had used to pressure the company. He also lost board observer access, strategic access, and the ability to represent Helix Core to investors. He did not leave quietly. Men like Preston rarely do. He threatened lawsuits. He blamed politics. He called himself the victim of a changing culture. But he could not erase the meeting transcript. He could not erase the recording log. He could not erase the email where he demanded the very clause that froze him. He could not erase Ava Folder. Proof had outlived his volume. Helix Core changed too, not magically. No company heals because one meeting goes right, but the board created a governance and culture risk committee reporting directly to Elaine. Human Resources Complaint Review moved outside the chain of command for senior executive cases. Investor decks now required sign-off from finance, legal, and the employee data owner for each major model. Retaliation protection became written policy, not a slide in training. Ava was not handed a grand title the next morning. Malcolm refused to turn her into a symbol before the company had earned her trust. Instead, she was asked what role she wanted. That question made her cry later in the restroom, not in the boardroom, not in front of cameras, alone. Because after years of being told where not to stand, being asked where she wanted to go felt almost impossible. 2 months later, she became director of market risk analysis, not because she had suffered, because she was right. Jordan reported to her team for corrected risk inputs during investor materials. That felt strange at first. Then it felt necessary. Elaine wrote a letter to the company that did not hide behind phrases. We allowed a senior leader to create fear. We allowed fear to distort data. We allowed distorted data to reach investors. This was a leadership failure, not an employee misunderstanding. We are correcting the systems that made silence safer than truth. Malcolm read the letter before it went out. He changed one sentence. Elaine had written, "Mistakes were made." Malcolm crossed it out. He wrote, "We made mistakes." Elaine looked at the edit for a long time. Then she accepted it. 4 months later, Helix Core held the Series D presentation again. Same building, same city, same 42nd floor. But conference room Orion looked different. Not because the furniture changed, because the room did. The screen no longer said leadership continuity and market expansion. It said responsible growth and verified risk. Rebecca Lang returned. Miles Chen returned. Anita Sloan returned. There were fewer promises in the deck, more evidence. The valuation was lower than Preston wanted. The trust was higher than he ever built. Jordan presented the corrected financials. Nina presented governance controls. Ava presented market risk and customer retention. She stood at the front without a folder pressed to her chest. Her voice did not shake at first. Then it did on the final slide. She paused. No one interrupted. That was how she knew the room had changed. Ava looked at the investors and said, "The strongest version of Helix Core is not the version where every risk is hidden. It is the version where the people closest to the work can speak before the risk becomes a crisis." Rebecca nodded. At the end of the meeting, North Star Growth Partners stayed in the round under revised terms. Harborline Ventures stayed. Eastbridge Capital stayed. The valuation was $7.3 billion, not $8.4. Preston would have called that losing. Malcolm called it surviving honestly. After the meeting, Ava stood by the window looking out at San Francisco. The same city, the same glass, a different reflection. Malcolm walked up beside her. "Are you all right?" Ava smiled faintly. "I'm thinking about all the times he told me to leave the room." Malcolm nodded. "Remember today too." "Why?" "So when you have power to open a door, you do not become the person who closes it." Ava looked back at the boardroom. She saw the empty chair where Preston once stood. She saw Jordan answering investor questions without hiding behind polish. She saw Elaine speaking with Nina. She saw younger analysts gathered near the screen, asking Ava for copies of the corrected model. For the first time, the room did not feel borrowed. It felt earned. 6 months later, a new line appeared on the wall outside conference room Orion. "Leadership is not who speaks loudest. Leadership is who makes truth safe enough to speak." Employees passed it every day. Some rolled their eyes because office wall quotes are easy, but others stopped. A junior engineer took a photo. A sales associate sent it to her sister. A new analyst named Marcus Bell Jr. touched the letters before his first presentation and whispered, "Safe enough." Ava saw him. She smiled. Not because the sentence fixed everything, because someone had built a reminder where fear once stood. As for Malcolm Reed, he never told the story as if he had defeated Preston alone. When reporters asked about the meeting, he said, "The company was saved by records, courage, and people who finally stopped treating silence as neutral." When asked about the equity freeze clause, he said, "A clause is only as strong as the will to use it fairly." When asked about Preston, he said, "No one is indispensable enough to be allowed to harm the people building the company." And when asked what he wrote in his notebook that morning, Malcolm finally answered, "The risk may be inside the person controlling the room." Then he closed the notebook. He did not need to say more. So if this story made you think of someone who was pushed out of a room they helped build, write their name in the comments. If you have ever watched a powerful person hide prejudice behind professional language, share this story. And if you believe leadership should protect truth instead of punishing it, subscribe for more stories where the overlooked speak, the arrogant are held to the rules they thought were for others, and justice begins when one person refuses to leave the room. Preston Hale thought equity made him untouchable. He thought investors made him safe. He thought a title gave him permission to insult a black chief executive officer in front of the whole room. But he forgot one thing. Power written into a contract can also become accountability written into a contract. He had signed the clause. He had demanded the clause. He had triggered the clause. And when the freeze hit, it did more than stop his shares from moving. It stopped the fear that had moved around him for years. Ava Monroe finally spoke. Jordan finally told the truth. Elaine finally stopped delaying. Nina finally read the line no one could shout over. And Malcolm Reed showed the room that real authority does not always enter loudly. Sometimes it sits down, opens a notebook, lets the wrong man speak, then uses the truth he recorded to set everyone else free.